In the year 1977, a movie you just might have heard of called Star Wars came out and thoroughly shifted the kind of films Hollywood considered blockbusters. Up until that time, the idea of an epic sci-fi fantasy grossing hundreds of millions of dollars was considered laughable, and the genre was considered B-movie material at best. Star Wars changed that thinking, and suddenly studios were bending over backwards, flooding theaters with their own sci-fi epics. This led to Star Trek getting a crack at the big screen, with the original crew headlining a movie that, at the time, was one of the most expensive films ever made.
Oh my.
In this episode of Revisited, we dig into Star Trek, the motion picture. Flashback to 1978. Star Wars was still making a mint, and Universal made the bold move of taking the pilot episode for a Star Wars knockoff series they developed called Battlestar Galactica and releasing it into theaters. It made a stunning $41.8 million internationally, a huge number considering it was just the TV episode that had already aired. Universal pulled a double when a few months later they released the pilot of another Star Wars knockoff they made, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, and it made $21 million, still a hefty sum. Clearly the appetite for science fiction was strong, and by 1979, theaters were flooded with Star Wars clones. There were brilliant ones like Ridley Scott's Alien, which subverted the formula, and then entertaining flicks like Disney's The Black Hole, and even the James Bond movie Moonraker, which takes a hard turn into sci-fi in the finale, sending 007 to space, and even including Star Wars-style laser battles in the finale. There were also dozens of Italian knockoffs like Star Crash and The Humanoid. Into the fray came Paramount Pictures, who must have thought they had the inside track as they owned perhaps the biggest sci-fi property of all, Star Trek. While the series had only run 3 seasons on TV, when it was sold into syndication, the show became a monster cult hit to the extent that the waters were tested when Paramount produced an animated series that played to surprising critical acclaim. Plans were made to produce another big-budget TV show called Phase 2, which was supposed to front a Paramount-branded TV network, which never came to fruition. The first season was set to run 13 episodes and would have included all of the original cast with the exception of Leonard Nimoy, who was in a legal battle with the studio over the use of his likeness in merchandise. He was replaced by a Vulcan character named Zahn to be played by David Gautreaux, while Persis Khambatta, a former Miss India, was hired to play Ilia, the ship's bald navigator. Then, of course, Star Wars came out, and Paramount opted to make Star Trek their next big franchise, with the hope of outdoing Star Wars.
Movie, 2 words. Star Wars.
How do you do that?
They hired Robert Wise, the director of West Side Story, The Sound of Music, and The Andromeda Strain, to direct, with a budget that was supposed to be capped at $15 million, which would have been $5 million more than what Star Wars cost.
Great kid! Don't get cocky!
However, including all the money they spent on Phase 2, the final production budget of the movie wound up being about $44 million.
Is there anything else?
No.
The original cast had already signed on to Phase 2 and were easy sells on Star Trek as a feature, but Paramount studio chief Michael Eisner made the decision to dump Zahn, with the actor getting a bit part in the film instead, and enticing Leonard Nimoy back as Spock. To accomplish this, Eisner cut him a check for the back royalties Nimoy had been asking for, and said he essentially got on his knees and begged the actor to agree to play the part.
Excuse me, will you sit down, please? You're blocking our view.
Sorry, Mr. Eisner. Excuse me. It'll never happen again.
Persis Khambatta was kept on as Ilia, but she would get a new love interest, Will Decker, to be played by Stephen Collins, who was a rising star at the time. What's interesting about Star Trek the Motion Picture is how oblivious Paramount at the time was about what made a good Star Trek movie. Rather than give the crew any villains, the decision was made to go in a more heady, cerebral direction, with the Enterprise being called into action to investigate a mysterious alien crowd called V'ger. One could tell this was originally the premise of the Phase 2 pilot, and this would become a recurring thing as far as Star Trek pilots went, with The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine also having these obtuse, action-free pilots that fans, for the most part, dismissed years later.
Data, how can you be programmed as a virtual encyclopedia of human information without knowing a simple word like snoop?
What's especially egregious about Star Trek the Motion Picture is how underused the original cast is. James Doohan as Scotty, Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, Walter Koenig as Chekhov, and George Takei as Sulu all have very little more than bit parts, and even the holy trio, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, are sidelined, although DeForest Kelley gets some crazy facial hair and a medallion in his first sequence as McCoy. Whoa, he looks like he just wandered in from Studio 54.
Damn it, Bones. I need you.
Badly.
The focus of the film instead would be on the two young love interests, Decker and Ilea, and the romance. The original cast is given little to do but react to the effects on screen. As for those VFX, they would lead to the film going massively over budget as the original team contracted to deliver them were not able to deliver the effects that they needed in time. Veteran visual effects pioneer Douglas Trumbull, who had already done this kind of work for 2001: A Space Odyssey, was hired and given an unlimited budget, with the only caveat being that he only had months to deliver the effects as the studio had a contractually mandated release date in December of 1979. Eventually, John Dykstra, who was one of ILM's pioneers with Star Wars but had since gone out on his own, was subcontracted. They made the release date, but barely, as Robert Wise, the director, had no opportunity to test the film and fine-tune it, and he always considered it unfinished.
They can't expect us not to look them over now.
Now that we're looking down their throat.
Right, now that we got them just where they want us.
The film unexpectedly was a decent-sized hit, as many thought it would be a gigantic flop.
And take a look at this.
It grossed about $82 million domestically. This, of course, is a far cry from what Star Wars made, but it was still one of the top-grossing films of the year. Although considering the budget, it only actually earned a profit after the international box office lifted it to $139 million, which is pretty good money for $1979. It would be the only time in the franchise's history until the J.J. Abrams directed reboots where a Star Trek feature would be considered A-level, with all future films being handled by the TV wing at Paramount, with Harvey Bennett replacing series creator Gene Roddenberry as the franchise's creative steward going forward. Star Trek the Motion Picture earned mixed reviews from critics, with many fans disliking it, even going so far as to call it the motionless picture.
It stinks!
Watching it now, it has to be said that the movie is pretty dull, with only Jerry Goldsmith's incredible score really standing the test of time. His theme for the film would be reused as the Star Trek The Next Generation theme, and it's rightly considered a classic. Much of the dialogue in the film is very cheesy, with the script a patchwork of contributions by writer Harold Livingston, Alan Dean Foster, and Gene Roddenberry himself.
It would seem our friendship messages have been received and understood, Mr. Spock.
I would say that was a logical assumption, Captain.
The film always haunted Robert Wise for decades, and it wasn't helped by the myriad of editions that were floating around. One of them was a so-called extended edition, which ran on television and was released on home video. Wise hated this version of the movie, which ran only 12 minutes longer and featured unfinished amateur-level VFX. In 2001, Wise was finally able to complete the film when Paramount agreed to finance a definitive director's edition, which, among other things, allowed him to redo most of the special effects with CGI. He also remixed the soundtrack and made numerous substitutions and additions throughout the movie, removing bad takes that he thought featured some dodgy acting. And if you watch the deleted scenes on the DVD, it's pretty revelatory to see what little cuts could actually make the film come out a lot better. And he made it an altogether much more polished version of the movie, which largely won over the fans that had always found it underwhelming, including yours truly.
One of them is refusing to step into the transporter.
Oh, I'll see to it that he beams up.
It proved to be something of a last hurrah for Wise, who died a few years later, in 2005. However, the fact that the new CGI for the director's edition had only ever been done in standard definition proved to be a major headache as home media moved into HD, 4K, and beyond, with the director's edition unreleasable until a major restoration was done by Paramount Plus, who released it exclusively on their streaming service and later put it out on Blu-ray and 4K. As the movie exists now, it's considered something of a curio for fans, but is more of an aborted launch for the franchise than anything else, which would only really take off with the release of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan in 1982. Persis Khambatta and Stephen Collins' involvement with the franchise would be short-lived. Khambatta's bald look in the film became a bit of a sensation when the movie came out, but when she grew her hair out, the thing is, she was unrecognizable, which might have hampered her career a bit. She'd go on to a well-received role in Sylvester Stallone's Nighthawks and would then appear in the action flop Megaforce. However, she would be faced with numerous health challenges, and the former Miss India would pass away in 1998 at only 49 years old. By contrast, Stephen Collins, for a while, had a very successful career, leading the cult TV show Tales of the Gold Monkey, and eventually moving on to the massive success on a family show called Seventh Heaven. Collins' career, which had been going pretty well up to that point, would end when, during a contentious divorce, a tape was leaked where the actor appeared to admit to the sexual abuse of a minor. He would eventually reveal to People magazine that he had actually abused 3 minors in 1973, 1982, and 1994.
How about new, you crazy Dutch bastard?
That would be the end of Stephen Collins.
You don't know what that'll do to you. Yes, I do, Doctor.
Happily, the main cast, while underserved in Star Trek The Motion Picture, were only at the beginning of their new silver screen adventures, with the series eventually launching Leonard Nimoy as one of the hottest directors of the 80s, when his reluctance to continue to play Spock was parlayed into a deal to direct the third and fourth films.
Well, my work is done here.
What do you mean your work is done? You didn't do anything.
Didn't I?
This series would reach its creative peak with the Genesis trilogy, which would be comprised of the second, third, and fourth films in the series, which would continue on until eventually the Next Generation cast took over. While Star Trek The Motion Picture definitely is not a favorite among fans, it remains an interesting watch.
Out there. That away.